Welcome to BICOM's Harian Weekly podcast. We are on episode 26, and I'm delighted to have with me our director in Israel, Richard Pater. Hi, Richard.
Hi, good afternoon.
Now, Richard has been closely following the story of the local elections this week. And really, I'm just interested to hear from you, Richard, like your sense of the picture that we now have after this really interesting set of results in the big cities and also some of the mid-sized cities.
Yeah, thanks, James. So we've had some very interesting results across the country. If we talk about for a moment the big cities, I suppose the big story was up in Haifa, where the incumbent mayor Yona was deposed after 15 years by a candidate that was backed by the Labour Party, and we can talk about afterwards about the ramifications, if there are any, for national politics. But certainly, Avi Gabay and the Labour Party saw this as a big success. A secular woman, a professional in municipal planning, also a black belt in karate, by the way. And what's interesting is that she was able to galvanise support not only from the Labour left and the further left of Meretz, but also the ultra-Orthodox parties were also seen outwardly advocating for her and celebrating her victory as well, which was very interesting.
Wasn't Yona Labour originally?
He was an independent. I mean, this is the trend across the country, that they have vague kind of national political affiliation, but not directly. So, in fact, it gets more complicated in Haifa. For example, there was a legal battle up until last week where the Secretary General of the Labour Party was also a candidate for mayor, and they ran a case to the Haifa District Court, not allowing Dr. Einat Kalish Rotem, who won, to stand because she was also being backed by National Labour. In the end, it was overturned by the Supreme Court, and she was allowed to run. So it's fair to say that all the major candidates in Haifa were all Labour orientated to some degree or another.
Right. And so what about the story in Jerusalem?
So the Jerusalem story is still to be completed. No candidate got over the 40% threshold. So we have a runoff of the top two candidates. And what was fascinating is that Minister Ze'ev Elkin, who is obviously very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, was running on another independent ticket. And the two he came third, but the two first place candidates was Moshe Leon, who came top, who is, I mean, first of all, it's an incredible story because he's been backed by other senior Israeli national political figures, significantly Aryeh Deri of Shas and Lieberman in Israel Beitenu. But his own party didn't get a single vote on the council itself. So he's kind of a one man ticket, and he's running up against Ofer Berkovich, who is, although he prefers to see himself as the candidate of everyone, he is a very young, he's in his 30s, a secular candidate that was representing the Hitorarut party, the Wake Up Jerusalem party, kind of the representing the secular pluralist bloc in the city. So those two will now face off against one another on November the 13th.
So what does that mean for Jerusalem? I mean, Jerusalem politics is often seen as this sort of a gradual process where the religious sector of the population will be a plurality and will be able to, in some ways, sort of impose their lifestyle on this secular minority.
There are two aspects which are radically changing. The first of all, which we're seeing as Jerusalem is the best scenario case example of this, but there are also other examples from around the country, which is a split in the traditional hold, a monopoly, one would say, of the rabbis, particularly in the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox sphere, where the Hasidim and the Lithuanian factions, represented by Degel HaTorah and Agudat Yisrael, are split and have ran for the first time in I think over 20 years, maybe 30 years since the 80s, have run on separate tickets. And so you had one candidate that put up from Agudat Yisrael had its own candidate for mayor, whilst Degel Yisrael decided to support Moshe Leon of the Shas party. So there is a realignment happening across the country between these two traditional partners. And the more interesting aspect within ultra-Orthodox community is the passing facade where listening to the rabbis is the only thing that matters when it comes to voting. And the best example of this is probably in Bet Shemesh, which it was so close they only called the results this morning. The ultra-Orthodox Shas affiliated mayor lost by just several hundred votes to a national religious female candidate, and she was able to galvanize and send a new message to the citizens of Bet Shemesh that she was representing everyone, also the ultra-Orthodox, also the national religious, also the secular.
How was she able to? How was she able to?
Was because of the. I mean, I think they're within the ultra-Orthodox community. They're referring to the era of the great rabbis. Is over. That over the last few years, we've seen particularly elderly, charismatic leaders of the ultra-Orthodox sects have passed away. And instead of 3 or 4 rabbis who make the decisions, it is now proliferated over to 20 odd different rabbis across the country. And so their ability to deliver their electorate is failing. That as well, and the fact that she came with a very new message as opposed to kind of some of the ugly, divisive scenes that we've seen in Bet Shemesh over the last few years. She came with a message, first of all, of zero tolerance towards violence, which should be the norm everywhere, but also a pluralistic message of working together, of not having it to be this one-upmanship, and really trying to change the agenda and the ethos of how politics was conducted in that city.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, in a very basic question that I suppose some of the political analysts look at is, who's won here out of the major party leaders? Has Gabay had a rare victory because someone who he supported in Haifa has won, and has Bibi in some way lost? Because I mean, his preferred candidate in Jerusalem came fourth, and in other places as well. Was it notably in Yerucham, his preferred candidate didn't do particularly well?
So, I mean, first of all, my first thing would be to caution reading any of this onto a national political level. That people vote on very different priorities and set of preferences when they vote in these local elections as opposed to national elections. So, I would be cautious to draw too many lessons from that. I think Bibi can still point to a number of successes where his man. Mostly his men in this case did win. In Netanya was a female mayor that stayed on that he was supporting, in Ashdod, in Petach Tikva, in Rehovot, and lots of places around the south, in Dimona, Sderot, and Netivot. Ofakim. There are plenty of success. I mean, listen, there are 251 votes, so every party can point to some successes. Labour certainly are considering that Haifa was a big success of theirs. They're also claiming Hudai, the legendary mayor of 20 years in Tel Aviv, who managed to keep his spot, despite the media suggesting it was very close. In fact, he attacked the media yesterday straight away, saying that his polls showed that he had the lead all along, and that it was just the media fake news, he called it, for kind of trying to sex it up and get it more exciting by saying it was a close race when it really wasn't. There were also some successes for Moshe Kahlon in Herzliya. Again, it was very close. Ashkelon was very close, but it went his way. And in other places, one would expect him to have. He's originally from the outskirts of Haifa and was expecting to have more of a support there. In fact, most of those places also went to the Likud candidate.
That's really interesting. So where does this leave us in terms of this idea that once the elections were over, the local elections, that would be a decision time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to decide what's going to happen in terms of national elections? We've still got this runoff, haven't we, for Jerusalem, which I think, does it take place on November the 14th?
There's another one of these. There, out of the 251, there are 25 that are going to a runoff on the 13th. One of the more amusing battles is in Bat Yam, where you have 2 Likud candidates facing off against each other. Prime Minister Netanyahu is backing one of them. The other one is being backed by most of the other Likudniks, as well as Gidon Saar from the outside, as well as the coalition chair, Amsalam, etc. Minister Levin is also backing there. And so there is a question there. They're putting pressure on the Prime Minister to pivot and support the official Likud candidate in some of these places. And so there is starting a talking of Miki Zohar was caught on audio calling the Prime Minister behaving like an arsehole, which is not the sort of language you expect from Likud MK. So there is kind of an emboldening of the Likud street that perhaps thinking about a post-Netanyahu world, that they need to kind of present themselves and kind of lay their authenticity towards the Likud cause. But I would say I think you'll find most of these people will snap into line pretty quickly when one talks about the national agenda. There is still heavy speculation that the Prime Minister could go could go for call early elections. Again, we discussed on a previous podcast about the December the 2nd date that the High Court has set for passing the induction into the IDF for the ultra-Orthodox recruitment, and that will be a big test of whether kind of in today's kind of what we've discussed about the ultra-Orthodox, whether they can have enough unity to put together a line that can prevent Netanyahu. Netanyahu will need an excuse like that as a prerequisite to go to early elections, but right now he's still keeping everyone else guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think we were going to have a brief discussion about the BICOM polling that was published this week. And for our listeners, our regular listeners will know that BICOM does a poll of UK attitudes to Israel and the Middle East every year. And we measure a number of sentiments about warmth towards Israel and the Palestinians, support or opposition to boycotts of Israel. And this year we threw in a new question after all the events over the summer, where Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader in the UK, faced accusations of anti-Semitism because of past actions and his inability really to explain himself. So we asked some specific questions about that. Some of this was covered in the Israeli media. I think did you see some of the Jerusalem Post and Times of Israel talked about this, and they led with the probably the most eye-catching headline, which was in a question about, do you believe that because of his past actions and his words, Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite? 38% of the British public believed that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, and just 25% thought that he was a committed campaigner against racism and all kinds of anti-Semitism. So you saw, didn't you, Richard, some of the coverage in the Israeli media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that that Israelis are following very keenly the horrific rise in anti-Semitism across Europe and obviously now in the States as well. When you have such a prominent European country with such a difficult opposition leader, it's fascinating news here. James, I was going to ask you about the polling as well, that we've also this is part of our annual review that looks into UK attitudes towards Israel. I wonder if you could maybe say a few words about kind of what struck you most this year overall about Israel's perception, about the UK perception of Israel.
Well, the thing that is interesting is what's uninteresting, if that makes sense. I mean, there's a great deal of stability in the answers to the questions. So on the core questions around, we measure warmth towards Israelis and Palestinians, and we've been doing this for many years, and really the trend is absolutely stable. I mean, this year it was 23% expressed warmth towards Israel, 23% expressed warmth towards the Palestinian Authority, and supporters of either side, would want that to be higher. But the issue is really that they are about the same, and they haven't really changed over the last few years. My analysis really of why that is there's not been any game-changing, very bad event or even good event for either side that has changed the perception of them in the eyes of the UK public. So there's great stability. We have seen on the long-term trend that the support for both was in the 30%, and that really dropped off just under 10 years ago. And you could see that that's potentially linked to some of the very intense conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians, and also the Lebanon war in 2006. But really, there's great stability. In terms of the key question about boycotts, and this is something I know that in Israel people are very focused on, and also in the US, is to what extent does the British public support boycotts of Israel? And you hear a lot of stories about activist groups who can be very loud and very vociferous in their criticism of Israel. They actually only represent, according to our poll, 14% of people in the UK who say that they support a boycott of Israel. For Israel's friends, 48% of people in the survey say that they oppose boycotts of Israel, which is a very significant figure, and it shows you there's a real majority there, and perhaps it's something to do with the sort of British sense of fair play, but it's a very significant number. And there's another question that we asked that also gets into some of the narrative here when very nasty things are said about Israel, is to what extent do people believe that hating Israel and questioning its right to exist is anti-Semitic? And we've been asking this question now for 3 years, and it's slowly crept up. And we had 47% of respondents saying that they agree with that statement, that hating Israel and questioning its right to exist is anti-Semitic. 20% of people disagree with it. And in terms of the bilateral relations, it's also quite interesting. You've got a very high number, 49% of people who agree that Israel is an important British ally in the fight against terrorism. And that's a higher number than any other Middle Eastern
Fantastic. No, that's definitely good news and good to hear. And what about in terms of with Brexit looming and how they view Israel as a trade partner as well?
Yeah, I mean, the trading partner one is interesting. I mean, there's an awful lot of stories about Israeli tech and about how we've seen trade figures between Britain and Israel booming. But actually, when you ask the British public, who is the most important trading partner after Brexit, they actually rate Saudi Arabia as the most important trading partner after Brexit. Second is Qatar. Israel is third at 38%. It's moved up slightly. It's edged Turkey out. Turkey is now is now fourth. And there's also an interesting thing just to note about Turkey in the survey. Turkey is the country in the region that the UK public feels most warm towards at 24%. Which is also quite interesting, and the least amount of warmth is actually towards Iran.
Very interesting
at 9%. So I think let's leave it there. We've discussed an awful lot this week, but Richard, thank you so much for joining us, and we will speak again next week.